large or small, whether they are the city centers or they are the neighborhoods or suburban areas of cities or peri-urban areas, they are, uh, they are also important spaces and opportunities for sharing. So they present opportunities for sharing lives, for sharing spaces, for participating, and for accessing resources, among many other meanings that they have. And so, particularly in cities of the global south and say cities in India, uh, the cities are lands of opportunity and for making it and for survival for many of the migrants who come into the city. Of course, the experience is mediated by class, by formal education, by skills, and so on. But on the whole, for people who come into the cities, they are really seen as land of opportunities. They're constantly changing, and um, every city, and each of us who is connected with a city or lives in a city knows that there is change taking place all the time. Some of the changes are more noticeable than the others, but cities are always in flux. And for this lecture, I'm going to draw on some ideas from the UN Habitat report of 2010, 2011, and some other literature, Partha Mukhopadhyay, Sujata Patel, and their writings, and the other references that I have shared with you before this session. So, so the UN Habitat report basically uh, begins this discussion on the urban divide uh, by telling us what it is. And of course, we do know what it is. It's essentially the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But then what are the implications that this has for the type of cities that we are building or the type of cities that we are inhabiting and making? And uh, there is this concept of open cities and closed cities, of inclusion, exclusion, and marginalization that become very important when we are understanding the urban divide. So, you know, why is there a gap between the haves and the have-nots? What implications does it have for the type of city that is being built or the experience of the city for various populations? What is an open city? What is a closed city? And how does inclusion and exclusion of diverse populations work within the dynamic of the city? These are some of the questions that will run through. I mean, I'll try to answer them through this presentation and discuss them, not only answer them. The approach here is more, rather than describing the urban divide, I'm looking at contextualizing it and understanding maybe some contributing factors um, in the creation of this divide between populations. And of course, what are the implications of such divides? And do we see that the divide is increasing, or, in some ways, is it being addressed and perhaps diminishing in certain cities or parts of cities? And to do this, uh, this, I'm examining this point through a close look at Mumbai, which is the city that I'm embedded in and which is very closely part of my work and my life, and done considerable work in the city of Mumbai. So I thought I'll draw on insights from fieldwork, from research, and discuss the urban divide in Mumbai. When we examine the nature of the divide, it must begin with a look at the history of urbanization in India, because there is a reason why we are where we are and the type of cities that we have built and made. And the history of urbanization in India essentially points towards a dual structure of urbanization. And we know that in the post-independence period, when nation building project was underway, there were large number of public sector units that were set up by the government of the time with the idea of creating hubs of development, of industrialization, and drawing populations to those areas, building them as townships. And so remote areas of the country were populated and were developed through the public sector units and the nation building project. And what happened over a period of time was that there was a kind of duality that emerged with large cities like the four presidencies that had a colonial history, and the newer cities that started coming up, and the townships that started coming up. And so you had large and small cities that came up, and urbanization took a form where it was not really very even. It was not always planned, and yet it was dispersed in a certain way. And you had some regions in the country that were more urbanized than the others, so more populations in the urban centers than other states, and that is what continues to exist today. So we do not have only a large city format of urbanization, but we have the large and the small cities. And we've also had interventions by the state where cities have had to compete for certain resources. And so some scholars have also looked at the fact that small cities, in a sense, subsidize the larger cities and industry in the larger cities by supplying labor, by being the hinterland, the market for the products of the large cities. And in a sense, there is some injustice done to the smaller cities because they do not see that much of investment and resources coming in for their development. That notwithstanding, cities are constantly changing. They are being built, rebuilt, transformed, and occupied by different groups. Parts of the city see changes in the uses or the purpose of the city. So an industrial area can become, you see in some cities, shifts from the industrial area into a residential area, or different uses of the land and the space of the cities. So the concepts of planetary urbanization and subaltern urbanization also become relevant when you're looking at urbanization in India. And planetary urbanization is basically also highlighting the fact that we do not focus only on cities or as boundaries, cities as bounded entities in order to study urbanization and the urban processes, but look at spaces where there have been various kinds of developments and proliferation of maybe resources, new structures, movement of people, and hence a certain kind of an urban system that has emerged. It need not be a neatly bounded town or a city. Subaltern urbanization is basically about the idea of in situ growth of cities. So population centers or settlements, they remain where they are, and the city comes in and they become part of the city. And you see this type of urbanization in around many large cities in India, for example, where there were villages, and they stayed as villages. They were governed by panchayats and so on. And the city, in a sense, swallowed them, or urban sprawl kind of encompassed these areas, and eventually they become part of the municipal area. So you also have subaltern urbanization, which is referring to urbanization from below, or the morphing of settlements into parts of the city. What becomes important for us in this discussion is that some of these changes are visible and some of them are not. And likewise, people and populations too are visibilized or invisibilized in these processes of change and transformation that take place with cities. So the point I'm making here is basically that urbanization in countries like India is not a neat or a planned process. we have a problematic also of the definition of the urban. And if we really follow the definition of the urban, it doesn't account for a lot of the urbanization that takes place in the country. So there is a limitation of how the Census of India defines the urban area, which is why the peri-urban areas, the urban fringe, really it gets neglected, and it is also not given the resources and the attention that it deserves. And therefore, because of the confusion of whether it is to be treated as a rural area or an urban center. And so there is this larger question and debate around development of the peri-urban area, which is a very important one, because although these are fringes of the city, but people are very closely connected with the city centers, or parts of the city where their jobs and their workplaces are, and so on. And so you see a movement of populations very much throughout all of these regions. Why the discussion on the urban divide is, I think, most crucial at this juncture in particular, is because it is really about justice, about freedoms, about opportunities, and how do people kind of develop their full potential, meet their aspirations, lead the kind of lives that they want to, or even survive, which they're not able to do in maybe other areas where they are based. And very importantly, it's a significant point to examine in order to study what happens with solidarity, what happens with social solidarity, what happens with the sense of community as cities are growing, what are the implications of the changes that are taking place. So here I'm using a few pictures to highlight some points. This is the Bombay, now Mumbai, and those of you familiar with the city know that this is a very famous landmark of the city, the picture that we have on the screen. It is what used to be known as the Victoria Terminus Station, and is now renamed as the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus. Okay, so it is a railway station which is very significant, also very significant because if you have seen the Hindi movies of the 1960s, 70s, and onwards, many movies started with the scene where the migrant arrives in the city of Mumbai and, is overawed by this structure. And he or they, depending on whether it's the family or it's a single male migrant, they're looking at the structure and they're looking up at it, and the story of their dreams and their struggles and travails in the city, it begins from this scene. So the first picture here, it's really a 20th century and perhaps a middle 20th century view of the Victoria Terminus station. A few people here, and you can also see a bullock cart in the background, but here it is, the station. And if I show you a picture of the same station, same spot just now, there will be almost no space to stand. I mean, it is a very much more crowded, scenario at present, because there is a huge flow of people in and out of the station and around the station area and so on. Why I took this other picture, which is the colored and the brightly lit one, as some of you may have seen it if you visited the city. It is a picture of the station lit up on 26th January. But I have taken it to basically highlight that there is some kind of a dream that planners have for policymakers, legislators, they have for the city. There is a dream to make it shiny, beautiful, and appealing to local people and to outsiders. And I think that this whole uh, idea of beautifying the city and the highlighting the monuments, it makes a statement of a certain kind of an aspiration. So hence this picture. Here you see the two maps. One is the Mumbai city and the other is the metropolitan region. If you see the format of urbanization across the country, cities, large cities in particular, have grown into much larger administrative regions. So this first map here, this part which is orange colored, is Mumbai city. And Mumbai city itself has expanded in the northern and the eastern direction. And so the limits of the city have been stretched very much beyond what it was in the 1970s and 1980s, when it was, say, till about something like here, Bandra, Santa Cruz, Dharavi. I mean, this was the city limit, and then it just continued to grow in the northern and the eastern direction. So the city itself has grown, but you can see very clearly that the land is very limited. And so the question of uh, a lot of the developments and the changes that have taken place in the city, you see land as a very crucial and central point of concern in the kind of decisions and policies that come up and the direction that the growth of the city has also taken. The second picture shows us the Mumbai metropolitan region. And here, this part is just the city. And that's two districts, the Mumbai city district and the Mumbai suburban district. And the rest of it, which used to be the hinterland, is now part of the Mumbai metropolitan region, which means that the entire process of planning, of administration, of this whole region has become a much larger exercise and has also been resulted in the bringing in of newer agencies of the state. So previously, say you would have the Mumbai Municipal Corporation that administered the entire municipal area. But now for the MMR, this entire region, you have the Mumbai Metropolitan Region Development Authority, which plays a very key and central role in the planning for the entire region. So the point I'm making here is, see, the boundary of the city has, in a sense, it has been broken. And it is now a region that we're talking about. The implications of this for governance and for administration are very significant. So you have so many municipal corporations. Each of these is a municipal area. All of these have urban centers and villages, especially on the fringes. There will be rural and urban centers in all of these areas. And this entire agglomerations, all of these urban agglomerations together make the Mumbai metropolitan region. So boundary shifts and changes, administration and governance shifts and changes are very much the starting point of this whole discussion. So along with this, as the city grew into the metropolitan region, you had a huge emphasis on infrastructure projects. And what were these infrastructure projects? So they were the flyovers, the railway lines, expanding all of these so that people could commute and travel to the center of the city for work. And mind you, here the center is not really somewhere here. The center is in the south of the city. And so there is a massive flow of people on an everyday basis from the far off areas. And I'm not even looking at the first map now. I'm saying it's the second map with this whole MMR region, from where people are commuting right to the city center on a daily basis. Of course, there are other whirlpools of commuting where people travel to other regions. Everybody doesn't come into Mumbai city district, but significant populations come here. And so your local railway lines are all connecting these regions. So infrastructure projects, informal settlements, redevelopment, and migrant labor. I've kind of listed these, but these are all really very much connected. And essentially, if you try to trace the urban divide in the city and its region, then you see that, some of these projects or shall we say, the policies and designs of the state have resulted in newer boundaries that have got created. So say, for instance, informal settlements, the slums. Now, whether it is, the slum is to be demolished, which was the original idea in the 60s, 70s, and we don't want slums and slum dwellers, and so demolish the slums. But then they were here to stay, and finally you also needed them to provide services. So how do you deal with them? And then you say, okay, no, let the slums be there. We will improve the conditions in the slums. So sites and services schemes and schemes that provided basic infrastructure for the slums, they came up. The next shift was to upgradation of the slum, and then from there to development, and then to now the phase that we are in, where we are saying that there will be redevelopment of these slum areas. And redevelopment is a project that has really, it's gone beyond the slum. And it's not only about reconstruction, but it is about relocating large populations from one part of the city to the other. And all of this work, as well as at the receiving end, is the migrant labor, because they are the ones who are inhabiting the informal settlements. And, ironically, they're also the ones who are laboring on all these construction projects. So they are the ones who are really at the center of these processes of change and transformation of the city that are taking place. If you see the history of the city, there is a logic of the way spaces were organized, land was used. And I mean, I'm not saying that it was always very fair or inclusive, but it had a particular logic. And as waves of migrants came in, they settled down. There were mixed neighborhoods, and there was interdependence among the middle classes and the working class populations, and they coexisted in the same neighborhoods. So there was some logic to it. More and more, what we see is a shift towards policy-led organizing and reorganizing of the spaces. And just to give a few quick examples, here you have the central Mumbai, where the malls were located. Where the malls are located was earlier entirely mill land. And with the textile mill strike in the 1980s, the entire history of those areas of the city has been turned around. Housing, infrastructure, health, education, services. These were self-sufficient neighborhood for the mill workers, and it has now totally changed. And you have the poshest looking malls that have come up there. You now, in one part of the city, you also have an upcoming Central Park that is there, more than 100 acres. And this is very much a dream of the state. I mean, the government wants it to come up, and successive governments have aspired to build the Central Park. So the spaces are changing, the land use is changing, and so is then the flow of population, or the people who are coming into these areas and using these areas and making them. That is also undergoing a change. Along with this change that is taking place, this transformation, civil society action continues. In fact, neighborhood groups and non-profits have been one of the strong points of urban community organizing in Mumbai. And they proliferated, they address local needs, they have the closest connect to the local neighborhoods and communities, and they work in their interests. Mukhopadhyay talks about, I gave one of his articles, I think it was there in the readings, but he talks about the fact that, the labor market and the social distance and urban governance, these are key points, almost creating a crisis for the cities. And maybe our cities are not ready to be engines of growth because of the problems with the labor market and the distance among the populations and the failure of decentralized urban governance. This is an example of some projects. These pictures actually highlight that. The first picture here is a resettlement and rehabilitation site. People were displaced because infrastructure projects came up. And this is one of the colonies where, they have been relocated. As you can see, these are high-rise buildings. So people from ground floor tenements have been moved into high-rise buildings, and entirely new neighborhoods where they do not know their neighbors, and they're having to start rebuilding community from scratch. The second picture is actually of Dharavi, and it gives you an idea of the mixed neighborhood. If you can see the high-rise buildings in the backdrop. And interestingly, Dharavi is today located on very prime land It's up for redevelopment. You must have read about this project that's coming up, but it is a huge real estate zone with real estate potential in the city. And this is one of the other projects that is going to lead to significant relocation and displacement of population from the area. So continuing to talk about the divides, these are the policies of the state are, I would say they run through the decades. But there are specific events that have left a mark on the city and on its populations and on the relationship between different sections of population. The textile mill strike of the 1980s and after. We also had communal riots in 1992. Then you had at least 2 or 3 terror attacks in the city, the floods of 2005, and then the more recent pandemic. Each of these caused some kind of a rupture and some kind of a churning or galvanizing of people into action. And so when you look at what happened to solidarity, what happened to the sense of community, and to relationships between populations, these events played an important role as well. They organized and reorganized city spaces. We know, for example, that the pandemic created all those zones, the containment zones, and the boundaries that were drawn where you could not move from one to the other. I think we have all lived through that, so I'm not getting into details of it. But it created boundaries over and above the administrative divisions and boundaries. So it didn't matter which ward of the city you were in, but it mattered whether you were a containment zone or a safe zone. Those divisions became more significant in the time of the pandemic. In the time of the say the riots, it resulted in red lighting, I would say, or highlighting some neighborhoods that became red spots, where it was you needed to watch closely what was happening between communities and their relationships and everyday interactions. And they were also therefore more the subject of vigilance by police, by authorities, and they were administered more closely than other neighborhoods were. So each of these events highlighted certain city spaces in particular ways. The idea of the neighborhood actually gained significance. And I think that all of these events really showed the fact that finally it comes to how people relate to each other on an everyday basis. Whether it is the riots, whether it is the insecurity caused by terror attacks, or whether it is the floods, but it's people who help each other, as neighbors. And a lot of the organizing responses and the solidarity building therefore took place at a neighborhood level. So as a unit for study, analysis, and practice, the neighborhood kind of gained great importance through all of these events. We also see that there's an uneven impact of some of these crises. Just to give you the example of the floods. In 2006, when the floods took place in Mumbai, there were some parts of the city that were extremely drastically affected. One of these where we worked with civil society organizations that we know is the far eastern suburb of Mumra. And, it was actually, it came up after the riots of 92. You had a huge population of Muslims that gravitated towards that part of the city and they settled down there. And it became a Muslim dominated area. So this was in the 1990s. And then in 2005, with the floods, it was like a double impact. And the floods destroyed one side of the houses because the creek flooded, and the other side there was a landslide, and all of it, raised questions of local community response, the role of the neighborhood, and the response of the administration and the state. How do they treat the neighborhood, and how do they address these issues? Uh, Importantly, what comes up is the transient boundaries that also, emerged during, say, the pandemic. They served a purpose, but they built on existing solidarities. So the boundaries or the definitions of zones were fleeting, but they were built on existing solidarities of the neighborhoods. So Dharavi, which was seen as a big, success in managing the pandemic, one of the largest slum settlements in the city, but it counted on the existing solidarity and relationship of that community in the time of the crisis. And then the crisis further, brought people together and, facilitated community and collective response. What are the forms of solidarity that we see through these crises and people rallying together, community-based organizations, local groups coming out and responding, helping people, whether it is through food supply, whether it is through saving lives of people, accessing health services, all of that. But people really came forward to respond to their own communities and to other communities which needed the help. For example, during the floods, there was a lot of traffic on the highways, and there were strangers stuck on the highways in the traffic, near to your homes. And the neighborhood groups came out and they helped them and they assisted them with food and with shelter and allowing them to use the facilities at home and so on. So we see that this solidarity was in one sense episodic, and yet there was also the longer term side of it, as some of it continued into longer term responses for to prevent such situations from coming up. See, here in this picture, I'm talking about visible changes. The first one here, it is actually what used to be a mill and is, of course, now abandoned. And the decision about how the mill land is to be used is, there was a court ruling on it, and some of the lands have been sold and are being used for commercial purposes, as the next picture shows. Here you see one of the biggest malls in the city. It's come up right on the mill land, and it is named after the mill that it has actually, on which land it stands. So this is the Phoenix Mall, and the people that visit it, they won't be the same people who lived there or who worked in the mills and so on. We're talking about shifts and changes, and of course, the discourse on the right to the city, it is very central to all of this discussion. But the key question is, right to which city? Which city are we talking about? Do we really want to own this city the way it is? Or is there something that we need to change about the city? And so you have the spatial inequalities and segregation. That is the existing inequalities and segregation in terms of class, caste, gender, religion, ethnicity. People were more organically organized. I don't want to also glorify that kind of organizing. There were exploitative and discriminatory elements within that. And you could have an organically organized neighborhood, but people don't connect with each other. So then there is really not much of a relationship there. But they were organized according to certain patterns. And with 60% of the city's population living in the slums, there is very obviously a class divide in terms of housing, and obviously then in terms of the type of work that people are doing. And most of them were in the informal economy. We also had then, with physical shifts or displacement or relocation, or people choosing to move houses when they became more prosperous, moving out of a slum into a building or into a more secure housing, those shifts took place. But along with that, there were also enclaves that came up. So colonies or neighborhoods, like the one that you saw in this picture, the Lalubhai compound, this first picture that you saw, they came up and they were created by the processes of resettlement and rehabilitation. And then the coming up of the gated communities and communities that were exclusively for vegetarians, for example, and a gated community where you had your place of worship also built in, such a facility for the residents and so on. I mean, it is very striking that that it is so accepted to talk about gated communities, even in advertisements and in all public discussions, that the sense of inclusion and exclusion is almost erased in everyday life of people, because it doesn't matter that it's a gated community and street vendors cannot enter, an outsider cannot enter, a person from a certain community cannot rent a house. All of these rules are very much in place, and they are very publicly also known and discussed. The other group that you see is also the home-based workers. And I'm talking about this as segregation and spatial inequalities because more and more the informal settlements have become sites of work. They are workplaces. And so the women home-based workers, and there are thousands and maybe millions of them across cities in India, they are most invisible. And yet they are part of the supply chain and the manufacturing chain, and very much doing the core work of, say, garment processing and, of products that will be exported or sold in the domestic market. But we would never see them. And very often, they also don't meet each other because they are so busy working throughout the day. The second point here is that of people, which is that, what are the flows of people like? Where are they flowing, moving, and where are they not moving? And you see that some new flows begin, but then the existing flows also stop. You cannot, a particular part of the city does not mean the same thing to you anymore. It's not your place of work. It doesn't provide the services that you need. So you stop going to those parts of the city. Some classes of people access other parts of the city, some don't. And so more and more the spaces and the neighborhoods and the facilities are being known as places for certain sections of the population. And so the flows and stops of the population also undergo changes. And of course, there are the rules and practices where the official rules will say one thing, but the practices work on a different tangent sometimes. So a single male migrant from a particular religious community will find very difficult to find a house on rent. And I think this is what you see in some cities across the country. Everyday interactions, work and living spaces, they're shrinking and they're expanding. And just as mobility for some sections of the population is becoming even more restricted, it is really expanding for others. So the city is not just your place. I mean, it's not your oyster. You're moving out much beyond the city. You are, moving between one city to another for work, for education, for different opportunities. And there is another side of the city population, which is more and more withdrawing into its own room or into its own workplace and actually not able to move out of that beyond a point. The fragmentation of families is also a process that accompanies a lot of this informal work, because it is unaffordable to have the entire family living in the city. And so in many instances, the children or the rest of the family is in the village with the grandparents or with elders who are looking after them. So the perception and meaning of this, how do people see this? How do residents feel about where they are in the city, and how do they experience this divide? And in one of the studies that we did, for example, where people had been relocated to a building in an enclave far away from where they lived earlier, they were saying that, this is the edge of the city. In the village, we lived on the edge of the village because we had no resources, or we belonged to marginalized castes. And in the city, we are living in the edge of the city, and we have been sent here again through this project. So these are some, it's anecdotal, but these are some of the perceptions that people have. Sanitation worker cannot get into a public transport or into a restaurant to have a cup of tea because of the work, the attire, the stink that permeates, that's there around them. And so there are very overt exclusions from certain places and spaces that you actually see. Here are some more visible changes that have taken place in the city. Here, you see the famous monument, the Gateway of India. And after the terror attacks, there was increased securitization of that area and some areas of the city. So you actually have physical barricades there today, which you cannot see in this picture. You can just see the security personnel, but there are physical barricades which regulate the crowd in this place. Uh, these two pictures are of Mumra. That's uh, the minority community, Muslim-dominated area that came up in the 1990s. See, this picture is a certain view of Mumra, and I was also very taken aback when I saw this one. That there is a gentrification of that entire area that is taking place, and there are numerous housing projects that are coming up, and the sense is that in the next 5 to 10 years, it will look very different. But so in a physical, in terms of physical growth and changes, uh, there will be a visible shift. But socially, what is it that is going to change is a question we have to wait and watch. The implications for solidarity of all of these aspects of the changes that are taking place and not changing or not taking place. So the internal displacement of the populations from one part of the city, involuntary displacement, this has led to social ruptures. A point that many scholars have actually written about, that how difficult and how much of a challenge it is to rebuild a community and set up your own networks, which you have lost because of being forced to relocate to another part of the city. Um, we also see that because of the mobility due to maybe increase in incomes over the years, many people have access to improved housing and they move to further suburbs. And so new neighborhoods also come up, and therefore there is potential for building new solidarities from scratch. This happened in the area where I did quite a lot of my fieldwork in the 1990s, and it was largely a slum settlement set up in the 1970s in one part of Mumbai. And they were all migrants from Maharashtra. And in the after around 2005, 2010, we saw that most of the people were moving to better housing because access to education and access to incomes and earning had improved their overall living conditions. So they moved to what they also said were better neighborhoods. And this neighborhood became a commercial come residential neighborhood with industrial units also coming in. So the use of that neighborhood and the entire character of the neighborhood actually underwent a change. The gig and platform workers, and I know that you've discussed this in other sessions, but they connect, although it's a fleeting connect, with different parts of the city. And on the whole, you also see that work and residence are merging for some sections of the population, particularly the women and the home-based workers. And the lives are becoming more atomized, more secluded, and everyday struggle and the hard work that they have to put in, long hours of work that they have to put in order to survive in the city, really is a big preoccupation for many sections of the population. In terms of reaching out to in such communities, one of the questions that we often encounter is, what will we get in return? And I think so what is in it for me? Why should I come for this meeting? I mean, you have to be really convincing and take people along and convince them. I mean, it's a long process if you have to have people with you in any of these change efforts, because there is a lot of skepticism and uncertainty about what you're really going to do for them and with them if you are talking about any kind of social change. And of course, social media has permeated the lives of most communities where other ways of information have not been able to reach. So this is a huge instrument for solidarity building and organizing. And it really works in the city context to bridge divides, because in one shot through a WhatsApp message. You can communicate so much so quickly, which you otherwise, you struggled to reach people across various parts of the city. Here are some gig workers, food delivery workers, and of course part-time work from home being advertised here. And this last picture, this is a home-based worker in one of the informal settlements. She is doing some work of, I think, preparing lamps. And here is another picture which shows women in, I think it is in Dharavi. They are working in the recycling industry. So that's the plastic recycling industry. The point here is so many and so invisible because they don't get counted in any discussion very substantively unless they are collectivized and they have a voice through that collective. What's the way forward for us, or what do we do with the harsh and yet exciting and yet divided city that we are in the middle of and that we are part of? And one of the answers is possibly to rebuild and regain community wherever possible, to join the dots, reaching the fragmented, invisible workforce and populations, and building local democracy and leadership. And also in the fact that development practice or working with communities has potential for changing things at the micro level as well as with policy and with the state. So really the way forward is to engage and to participate in the city as much as we can and to not let go of any of the spaces that actually come up for this. Yeah, I'll stop here.